They found a grocery frozen in time, an island of shelves in the belly of a ship, rows of tins and glass jars lined as if awaiting morning customers, labels still legible beneath a film of silt and salt. In the low, circular cone of a diver's light, it looked less like wreckage and more like a storefront that had been closed for a day, not a century. The ocean had become a cold museum, and the aisles were exhibits of appetite and habit. The descent began as it always does, a corridor of blue, then black, then the hulking silhouette of the ship, resolving out of pressure and shadow. The remotely operated vehicle hovered at the mouth of a collapsed passage and swept a beam across a space that at first read as a tangle of beams and crates. Then the shapes sharpened, rows of perforated metal, the repetitive geometry of shelving, and the camera caught, reflected back in 100 drops of suspended silt, the pale text on a tin. Biscuits for tea. A breathless silence ran through the control room. On the surface, someone said simply, "It's a grocery." What makes a store is not shelves alone, but the small intimacies of provision. Price tags inked by hand, flour sacks with stitch marks, jars sealed in glass and wired shut, crates stamped with the names of suppliers. Here, on the ship that became myth, the supermarket was a map of daily life aboard, comforts and necessities bound together. The find rewrote a day-to-day story we thought we knew only from grand ballrooms and promenades. Here, within the engineered arteries of a luxury liner, ordinary routines were stacked and labeled, and in many cases, remarkably preserved. Divers and ROV pilots speak of the moment with a strange reverence. "You don't expect to find a pantry arranged like a shop," one veteran said. There were rows, tins, jars, bottles, lined up in an order someone had intended. Canned tomatoes, next to condensed milk, rope-bound crates of biscuits, a rack where bottles stood like sentries. The light skated along embossed logos. In places, mason jars sealed with wax held cloudy liquids that shifted only when a manipulator stirred the water, long enough to disturb old sediments. In the mouth of a crate, there was a sack labeled in a careful script, T 2LB. The hand that had written it felt in the camera's tiny resolution, close and ordinary. How could consumables survive in seawater for 100 years? The answer is an interplay of material and chance. Many of the items were sealed containers, tins of biscuits, bottles with corks driven deep and waxed over, jars clamp-sealed, and then packed within crates that kept them sheltered. Metals can corrode, of course, but when cans remain sealed, the interior can stay anaerobic and cold, substantially slowing the decay of contents. Sugar crystallizes rather than rots. Alcohol persists. Vinegars preserve. The ocean did what overlords of preservation have always done. It arrested oxygen, sealed off microbes, and turned certain organic materials into relics of their former selves, rather than into soup. Still, survival was never uniform. Some tins had ruptured, their contents spread into the silt and eaten away by scavengers. A few glass bottles had imploded under pressure. But where packaging remained whole, the objects inside carried a tactile immediacy. Perfume bottles that smelled faintly of cedar when conservators opened them in a lab. Sealed tins whose printed labels revealed suppliers from Liverpool and Marseille. Jars whose contents suggested jams and preserves, condiments and pickles. A small corrugated box, when carefully opened in controlled conditions, revealed rows of tea packets, their paper still dark with age, but their aroma faintly, impossibly, evocative. A discovery like this does not speak only to preservation technologies, it speaks to networks. Labels told stories of trade routes and tastes, spices imported from far ports, biscuits stamped with British brand names, canned peas from a factory whose ledger later matched a supplier on the ship's provisioning list. For historians, the supermarket became a lens on consumption. Who ate what comforts were prioritized on long voyages, and how class differences turned up even in foodstuffs. A distinction between imported caviar tins for private suites and bulk salted beef for crew storerooms. The find also forced a shift in method. Archaeology at sea is always about layers of intervention and restraint. The site was treated as both grave and archive, a place of mourning, and a storehouse of data. Conservators established protocols immediately: high-resolution 3D scanning, careful mapping of every crate and tin's position, and non-invasive sampling where possible. Retrieval was the exception, not the rule. For delicate items, photographic documentation would have to suffice. For others, retrieval promised information that could be stabilized and shared. Each item chosen for recovery carried with it a question of ethics. Was the public benefit of preserving and studying this object greater than the cost of removing it from its resting place? The first boxes that came to deck were handled like delicate bones. Salt incrustations were removed drop by drop. Tins that had bulged and flaked were X-rayed to see the internal arrangement. Layers of paper, the cup-like shape of condensed. Milk, a pocket of air where a jar had been nested. Microbiologists waited with sterile benches to sample the contents in case any unexpected compounds were present. In one marquee recovery, scientists opened a screw-top jar that had resisted a century beneath waves. Inside was a pale preserve whose sugar had crystallized into a delicate lattice. Tests showed fruit acids preserved beneath the seal, sugars transformed but detectable. The compound was stable enough for analysis, giving researchers a taste, metaphorical and biochemical, of what a meal aboard might have included. The human dimension was everywhere. Among the recovered items, a steward's list slipped between crates told of orders placed before sailing. Quantities, brands, and the names of passengers who had requested particular items. A notation read, in a scrawl that trembled with haste, "Extra tins for Mr. and Mrs. Standard, private suite." The notation converted the supermarket into domestic detail. It suggested the personalization of provision, the way elites could order the exact tin of marmalade they preferred, while the crew ate more equivocal rations. Researchers cross-referenced the list with passenger manifests and family papers. For some families, the lists became points of emotional connection. A descendant who read the annotated page described in tears how her great-grandmother's handwriting had traveled across a century to touch the present. Encounters in the aisles were not all catalogue entries and lab work. The living sea had reoccupied the shelves, turning aisles into habitats. Small crustaceans nested in open tins. Anemones waved from cracked jars. A shy lobster had taken up residence behind a stack of biscuit tins. Marine biologists called this a succession, nature reclaiming human structure into an ecology. Where tins leaked, biofilms formed, attracting scavengers and algae. Where jars remained sealed, they became islands untouched. The dynamic was a reminder that the wreck was not a static diorama, but a place where human artifacts and marine life crossed paths. Sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with the friction of competing claims. Divers' narratives brought an eerie choreography to these interactions. One diver described entering what felt like a shop at midnight. There was this alignment. Cans stacked like soldiers, a scent of old paper when my light warmed the crate, then movement, tiny crabs hopping from one shelf to another as if shopping. For a moment it felt like the shelves were still being used, like some tiny economy had established itself around the goods. Another diver recounted pausing at a rack of bottles, only to have their ROV camera meet the lens of a fish that seemed to peer back with the casual curiosity of a customer, disturbed by a flashlight. These moments blurred the boundary between past human activity and present natural use. Conservation labs turned recovered objects into evidence. Food residues allowed scientists to run chemical analyses that revealed diets, the fatty acid profile of an open tinned meat suggested livestock feed patterns. Pollen grains trapped in tea wrappers spoke of fields in bloom at harvest. Isotope ratios in olive oil matched Mediterranean terraces. More than mere novelty, these analyses contributed to economic histories. What grew where, what shipped across oceans, and how pallets were formed by global exchange. Museums curated exhibits that paired the physical artifacts with these scientific narratives. A display case might hold a jar, its label, an X-ray image, and a panel explaining the botanical and trade data gleaned from microscopic residues. The ethical questions returned as exhibitions opened. Some activists argued that removing foodstuffs from a ship that was a cemetery for many was disrespectful. Others saw the recovered items as a way to humanize the lost, small relics that made the statistics of tragedy intimate and personal. Curators responded with humility. Exhibits framed objects not as trophies but as stories. Labels emphasized the fragility of retrieval and the conversations with descendant communities before display. Virtual reconstructions allowed the public to walk an aisle of the submerged supermarket without disturbing the site further.